ECON 112. All right, are you all ready? Are you excited? We're so close to the test. Wow, you're already you're flying through the information for this course. So remember that we had the first part of the course that covered chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the exam. Then we're on this part of the course, which covers chapters 5, 6, 16, and 17. This is the last chapter of that information until our second midterm. Now, remember, we do have the second midterm coming up. If you have any information that you need or any questions that you have, please reach out to me. Come by office hours. If my office hours times don't work for you, let me know. I can meet with you any other time. I'll work it into my schedule. But help me help you to be successful. Now, just so you know, exam 2 tends to be the hardest for students, right? So they tend to do fairly well on the first exam, fairly well on the third exam, but the second exam, a lot of students struggle in. So if you're having problems, let me know now so that we can try to fix it or correct it or come up with a really good solution to help you be the best that you can be. Okay, so if you need any help, reach out and let me know. So let me go ahead and screen share. Put this over here. All right, let's jump right into it. So today we're starting with the fun-filled world of externalities. Externalities are just these little bits of good and bad that are the disconnect in between what your private cost and benefit are to what the social cost and benefit are. And if these don't equal each other, if what you want doesn't necessarily match what society wants, then there might be some sort of market failure there that could be needed to be addressed. Externalities are these exterior events and forces and realizations, and I think they're just fascinating. So let's jump right into it. So what do you need to know from this chapter to be successful in your future life? First off, you need to be able to explain how externalities arise. So the good ones, the bad ones, the production ones, the consumption ones. You're going to need to know kind of how they happen, why they happen, and what do they mean, right? Next, you need to be able to explain why external cost, so these costs that are not necessarily in between the buyer and seller, but in society, how does that bring market failure? How is that a market failure? How could this represent an overproduction of something or an underproduction of something? And how can property rights and public choices bring us to a potentially more efficient outcome? All right, next we're going to talk about the tragedy of the commons. That one's actually pretty cool. I like that part of the lecture, so I'm real excited for that. And then finally, why external benefits bring market failures and underproduction. All right, so we're going to have sometimes when there's costs that are going to bring overproduction, and sometimes when there's benefits that are going to bring underproduction. I know that sounds confusing, but don't worry, I'm going to draw the graphs for you. So let's get into it. Externalities exist everywhere in our lives. Externalities are just an external cost or benefit that arises from the production and falls on someone other than the person or firm that is choosing that action. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I'm a steel company and I throw all my steel waste into the river. Well, okay, well, that's one cost for me, to take the truck and to throw the steel waste into the river. But there's a cost to people other than myself. There's the cost to the people that live along that river that now have a very polluted water source that they're unable to swim in, right? Or a polluted water source that they're unable to drink from. They now have a cost in their lives based upon my action, and I did not change my behavior based upon what their costs were. This is the disconnect that might happen in between what our private marginal benefit and cost are and what the social marginal benefit and cost are when we start considering everyone in the system. These external costs or these external benefits to other people, these are externalities. So we have two different types. We have negative externalities, like the one that I just said, polluting the river and a bunch of people now having a polluted water source. That's a negative externality. And sometimes there's positive externalities. For example, there's flu shots on campus. I got a flu shot done, and now the people around me are less likely to get the flu. That's not something that I necessarily considered when I went to go get a flu shot. I thought about what's my likelihood to get the flu. But there's a positive externality or benefit to society of now other people are less likely to get the flu. Sometimes there's positive externalities where these little bits of benefits happen to other people, and I'm not necessarily considering those when I'm making my private decisions, right? So these are things that we need to think about. How do we rectify what's happening in between private individuals and firms and society for different sort of transactions? And that's the entire thing that we're going to start to talk about. Now, first, we need to break it down into our 4 main components. So there's 4 different types of externalities that we focus on within this course. Kat, why are you tearing up my chair? Just tearing up my chair. All right, so we're going to have 2 negative ones and 2 positive ones. We're going to break this up into 2 different sides as well. Production-based externalities. So this is when the externality results from kind of the firm side or the seller side. And then we're going to have consumption externalities, where the externality arises from you consuming something, right? And I don't mean like consuming food, I mean like consuming a good or service. You use a good or service. So let's go through the first 2. Let's talk about production externalities. So a negative production externality are probably the ones that you are very used to, right? They're very common. These are the ideas of pollution that is created by different firms, or pollution that's created from different markets. For example, burning coal to generate electricity, it emits carbon dioxide, which is bad for certain places. Logging, we were logging to clear the forest to make paper, right? That's something that we're doing for the purpose of making paper and being able to sell it and people buying paper. But the cost that we're not considering is the destroyed habitats of the wildlife and the carbon dioxide that's not being taken out of the atmosphere and turned into oxygen. So little bits of bad that's happening to society for this personal transaction. Let's see other examples. Noise from aircrafts and trucks, pollution of rivers and lakes, pollution in major cities from auto exhaust. Have you ever been in downtown St. Louis just walking up and down the streets? You know it doesn't necessarily always smell the best because there's a lot of auto exhaust. That's not necessarily good for people. Hi, Kat. Hello. How are you doing today? What a good cat. All right, so these negative production externalities are when there's kind of pollution that's happening or some sort of external cost to society beyond what is necessarily happening for private citizens. This is Stormy, by the way. I'm pretty sure I've introduced y'all before, but just in case you missed that video, her name's Stormy and she's super duper cute. Okay, so that's the negative side of production externalities, the cost that happens from producing something. And that's the part that always trips people up on the test. So I would sit down and I would definitely think about different situations and if it's going to be production or consumption. Okay, so our next one on the production side is positive production externalities. This is when little bits of good happen, when society would actually like us to produce more of something because there's good happening from this production. These tend to be less common, right? Let me give you some examples though. Let's say honey and fruit. Okay, if I had a bunch of beehives and my bees, they go out and they beehive away and then they come back. I don't actually have beehives, but my partner's family has beehives and they're pretty cool, right? All the flowers in the neighborhood are a lot better off. All the fruit in the neighborhood is a lot better off. So by locating their honeybees nearby all these different fruit farms and fruit orchards, the orchards are doing so much better by the presence of these bees. But that's not necessarily what the beekeeper's considering, right? The beekeeper's considering, I can sell honey and I have bees. Here's my cost, here's my benefits. What they're not thinking of is the positive externality to society of the production of this honey. By producing this honey, there's more bees in the area. The bees take care of the fruit and the flowers and they're nicer. And then all the farmers, they're better off because of the presence of these bees. But they don't necessarily compensate them. They're not paying the bee people to stay around, because they're not rationalizing that externality, that extra little bit of good that's happening that's outside of the private decision. It's what's happening to society. Okay, so we have the negative side, which is polluting, and then we have the positive side, which are these little good benefits that happen from production. Okay, then let's go over to the consumption side. So production is when we're making something. Consumption is when we're using something. So this is when we're going to be using a different good or service. Much like the production side, we also have 2 versions of this. We have the negative consumption externality and the positive consumption externality. So negative consumption externalities are common in every part of life. You're probably pretty used to them. Let's say if someone's like smoking cigarettes out in public, everybody else around them is much more likely to have an asthma attack, and they're much more likely to get secondhand like cancer, right? So these are bad things that could happen to other people based upon someone consuming that cigarette. Think about when maybe you're hanging out at home, you're trying to study, you're trying so hard to study, and then all of a sudden this car comes down the road and it's just pounding music and it's just so loud, it's hard for you to concentrate, the windows are rattling, your baby's woken up and they're screaming. That person in their car enjoying the music, they're consuming that music, they're using it, they're using that good or service, but they're not necessarily factoring into their decision to listen to music, how it's affecting these households that they're passing, how it might be affecting someone trying to study in their home, right? So these are just negative things that are happening to society based upon someone using a good or service. The next is going to be, and this is our fourth one, our positive consumption externality. These are little bits of good that happen to the world when we consume something. So these are also relatively common. For example, like I said, I went to campus and I got a flu shot, right? When I get a flu shot, everybody who comes in contact with me is actually a little bit better off. Because since I'm less likely to get the flu, that means everybody who has contact with me is less likely to get the flu. So because I used the good or service of that flu shot, society's a little bit better off. That's a positive consumption externality. How about there's the Madison County Historical Museum right off of Main Street. It's this white building, or at least it was white. Right now they've been taking off a lot of the paint and getting it back to its original brick that's underneath. Well, the owner of this building taking care of it and restoring it and getting rid of that old nasty paint and making it really pretty downtown. Everybody who passes that now gets to see this really beautiful historic building in downtown Edwardsville. When they restore it, they're just thinking about their costs and benefits to restoring it. They're not thinking about all the happiness that the citizens of Edwardsville are getting as they're walking past this building, being like, that's a nice building, right? There's a little bit of good to society that's happening because that person chooses to just consume the services of restoring this house. Okay. So you notice that we've talked about society a lot in this. Well, that's because society has a cost and benefit to every single transaction occurring. And each individual has cost and benefit to every single transaction that they participate in. But the thing is, the private cost of participating in a transaction versus the social cost of participating in a transaction, these may not always meet. So we're beginning to distinguish in between a few different types of cost here, right? A private cost of production is the cost that's borne by the producer. Let's say that, what do we got today? Radio. Let's say that I produce radios, right? This one's kind of cool. You can spin it and then it has like electricity and stuff so that you can take it camping without having to need, electricity around, and you can like charge your phone. Okay, kind of cool emergency radio. So there's a private cost to producing this, right? Let's say that I'm the producer. It costs me the wiring, the plastic, the battery source, this little solar panel thing right here. Those are the private costs to me. Marginal private cost, remember marginal is the idea of one more. That marginal private cost might be the idea of producing one more of something. So what's the cost of just this radio? Maybe it's like $3 in parts for me. That's my marginal private cost. Now these are private costs, what's borne by just me, but that's not explaining what society is bearing. An external cost is the cost of production that is not borne by the producer. So for example, let's say that I'm building this. I am building this emergency radio, but for each emergency radio that I build, I put 2 pounds of plastic waste into the river. Well, I just throw it into the river and then I continue to make this, right? I focus on what it costs me to make this. This is my private cost. But society now has a cost from that additional plastic in the river. The marginal external cost, that's the extra little bit of cost that society, all the people living on that river, they have to deal with for each each one of these that I produce. So if I produce one of these and I throw 2 pounds of plastic into the river, well, it's 2 pounds of plastic's worth of damage that I'm doing to society. That's the external cost. So the private cost is my pieces, my labor, using the machinery, stuff like that. The external cost is the environmental damage of this, right? And the marginal private cost plus the marginal external cost, here we go, equals our marginal social cost. So we call this MSC. Notice that we have a couple different things here. We have, oops, our marginal private cost, that's just MC, and then our marginal social cost, MSC, is just this marginal cost, the MC, plus the marginal external cost. So marginal social cost, so I'm talking about the cost to society, that's the cost of the $3 in parts of this radio, plus the environmental damage from that 2 pounds of plastic. These put together represent what the marginal social cost to society is of one more radio, right? The goal sometimes is to make the private cost and the societal cost match so that we're making really, really good decisions on our pricing strategy and our quantity strategy by caring about what maybe happens to the environment or what happens externally, right? So marginal social cost is just the sum of this marginal private cost plus the marginal external cost. We express the cost in dollars. So it's typically a dollar amount, but remember that dollars represent the value of foregone opportunity. So I might say that the external cost of that 2 pounds of plastic is 50 bucks, but that may not represent what it necessarily is. When I chuck the plastic into the river, no one's handing me a $50 bill. When I chuck the plastic into the river, there's foregone opportunity of people using this river for leisure. There's foregone opportunity of people having a safe swimming and drinking water source, right? So it might be foregone opportunity that we're representing in a dollar sign because it's just kind of easier. If we can put things in terms of a dollar, then that's the great equalizer. It allows us to look at the cost and benefits of multiple programs to be able to try to analyze them. So marginal private cost, marginal external cost, and marginal social cost, those all go up with output. If I have one radio, then I don't have much, but it's much like marginal cost, right? Cost goes up the more and more you produce of something. So when I start to produce my 1000th radio, well, then I'm going further for parts. Maybe it now costs me $5 or $6 to make this instead of the original 3. And that 2 pounds of plastic that I chuck into the river, maybe we're just at the critical mass of what that river can handle. So maybe instead of $50 worth of damage, it's causing $60, $80, $100 worth of damage. Cost goes up the more we produce of something. So we have to figure out how we value an external cost. So let's suppose, actually, I'm going to pause for just a second and draw this out so that we can have it for an example. So let's assume that we have 2 pretty much identical rivers, right? And on each of these rivers, let's make our homes, let's make them brown. Brown's pretty. Okay, let's say, oops, brush. Let's say on each of these, we have Dr. Plemmmons' sorry attempt to make houses, which are really just dots. And let's say that we have 10 houses on both sides that are relatively identical, right? Same number of bedrooms, same number of chimneys, same number of, like, I don't know, land acres, you know, things like that. So 10 on both of these. But let's say that there is one difference in between these 2 neighborhoods. One of these rivers, let's say River 1, is a relatively healthy river. You can swim in it, you can drink from it. And then river number 2, let's put this in green. River number 2 is polluted. Maybe the steel company throws their waste in there, so it's not necessarily safe to drink or to consume or to swim in, right? Well, then there's going to be a difference in pricing in between these 2 neighborhoods, right? So maybe this house right here on this very clean river that everybody can go swimming on, maybe this one's going to go for $2,000 a month. While this house with the identical number of bedrooms and the identical number of chimneys and the identical acreage, so on and so forth, maybe this one starts to go for $1,500 because it's on this polluted river that people can't necessarily use, right? Well, if pollution is the only detectable difference in between these two houses, like they're identical in every other way except for this, then we kind of know what the cost of pollution in this one is, right? It's here, cost of pollution. That's going to be equal to this $2,000 minus $1,500. That's going to result in a $500 difference in between these two houses. That's completely caused by this polluted water being outside of it, right? So if we have 10 homes on either side of the river, then we know this $500 cost times 10. If that's 5,000, then we know that there's $5,000 in external cost. Now that's not private cost, right? The people who are buying the steel and the people who are producing the steel, they're making their trades regardless. But the thing is, they're not thinking about the external cost. The external cost is this $5,000 in lost home value because they're throwing their pollution into the river when they're producing, right? That's kind of the idea of what external costs look like. The problem is it's not always that easy to value because houses on both rivers may not be the same, or maybe there's more damage than just what's happening to rent prices. Maybe there's medical costs that are associated. So it's actually very difficult to value an external cost. But in this class, for the most part, I'm going to give you nice, easily understandable numbers like that. So let's think about external cost and output. First, let's think about the marginal private cost. So, tea break. Let's think about what a marginal private cost for the steel company would be, right? So here we see that there's a relationship in between the cost and the output on a river. Oh, I think I'd use the paint industry. Fine. Okay, we're painters now. Super cool. You probably saw in previous episodes that I had like my paint or my paintings drying back there. I am not good at painting. I attempt to paint and I am terrible at it, but it's a hobby. Okay, so we have this idea of marginal private cost, right? So let's say that there's a price and cost per gallon of paint. So this is what it's going to cost me to produce a gallon of paint. And then there's an amount of paint. So there, for each gallon, we see that we have this relationship. The more gallons we have, the higher and higher it costs to produce one more of some paint, right? So the marginal cost curve, the curve of producing one more of something, is slightly increasing. Now this is the private marginal cost, right? It's just considering how much I'm making on paint. It's not considering what's happening to those 10 houses on the river, right? So let's say in this case, to produce 3 million gallons of paint, when I do not care about what happens to the people on the river at all, that 3 million gallons of paint costs me about $1 per gallon of paint. Okay, well, let's add pollution in. Let's say that instead of just worrying about this, you know, $1 cost to me of making the paint, so that's the cost of like getting the little paint can thing and putting the colors in it and swirling it up, and that machine that shakes it real good. Those are my marginal private costs, and that might cost me $1. But if we consider the environmental damage, those 10 houses that, you know, landlords can't really get rent now, and people aren't really able to value and enjoy their homes, and they can't swim in the river, and they can't drink from the river. Well, if we think about that pollution, then we have an external cost. If we go up from this 3 million up to the $1 that it cost us, well, at 3 million cans of paint, maybe the environmental damage per can of paint is actually about 75 cents. So we go up and we see that we intersect with this new line. Notice that this new line is called MSC. This is our marginal social cost. Marginal social cost is just this private cost plus this external cost. Notice the more and more that we make, there's a larger difference in between marginal cost and marginal social cost. It's because marginal external cost increases or gets larger the more pollution there is, right? So this marginal social cost is equal to the external cost plus this marginal cost. Now there's some sort of equilibrium that's going to happen. So let's take away this marginal social cost again. Let's think about the equilibrium. All the way back in chapter 3, we talked about market equilibriums. It's where supply equals demand. In this case, we're talking about a production externality. So we're just looking at differences on the supply side. If I'm talking about a consumption externality, these are differences on the demand side. That works very similar. I tend to give examples on the marginal social cost side, and I ask questions on the marginal social benefit side, I think, in your homework. Okay, so we have some sort of equilibrium where supply equals demand. If we think about society's benefit from each can of paint and my personal, just my cost of producing that paint, if I'm only considering my own good, well, maybe I might produce 3 million cans of paint at $1 each. This is called an unregulated market. Unregulated markets are when we're only considering our private cost. We're not considering the cost to society. Now, let's instead say that we do decide to consider the effect on society. Well, if we know the effect on society, we know that we have this higher marginal social cost. That means at the 3 million cans of paint, if we go up, we see that our demand intersects with our supply, our marginal cost, so the private cost at $1. But if we really think about society's cost, if we add in the marginal external cost, then we see the societal cost at 3 million gallons of paint is equal to $1.75 per gallon of paint. That's a lot, right? If I'm making $1, but I'm doing $1.75 worth of damage, then that's not good for society, right? Society's losing out in that deal. Okay, let's instead think about where a different equilibrium would be. Let's look at the equilibrium for this marginal social cost curve. Notice that we have it lying kind of above our private cost. That's because it's more than just our private cost. It's our private cost plus this external cost. Well, this line, this marginal social cost line, it intersects right here with demand, or the marginal social benefits line. If we look at this intersection, we see that if we considered all the environmental damage that we were doing, if we considered the true cost to society, then what we would produce, the efficient quantity, so we call this the efficient equilibrium. It has an efficient quantity and efficient price. It's going to be the interaction with the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit. We see at this point, we would produce 2 million cans of paint and we would charge $1.25 for them. And that's where society would be happiest, if we charged a little more and produced a little less than if we didn't consider the pollution at all. That means that this triangle has now been created. Let's take this original equilibrium and let's trace it up to our new line. Well, we see that we've formed a triangle here. This triangle should look familiar to the stuff that we've talked about in previous chapters. This is called a deadweight loss. Notice that this deadweight loss is for the amount above what this efficient quantity is. So it's the amount in between 2 million and 3 million. Well, this deadweight loss, this represents an overproduction. That means that society is producing more than what they would, or well, these private companies are producing more than what they would than if they considered the environmental damage. If they considered all the damage that they're doing to these households, they would produce less, right? So that means if we're only considering ourselves and not society, that there's a deadweight loss occurring. These are trades that society would rather not happen. We call this an overproduction. We know it's an overproduction because we see that this gray triangle is to the right of our efficient quantity. Okay. So there's a couple things that we can do to rectify this. One of them is the idea of establishing property rights. So in this, I didn't necessarily say who owned the river, right? Does the river belong to the households or does the river belong to the company? Well, if the river belongs to the company, then the company has the right to pollute in it, and the households can try to give them a payment to get them to stop polluting. On the other hand, if the river belonged to the households, well, then if this company really wanted to pollute, what they could do is they could go to the people and pay them for the right to pollute in their water. It's still some pollution, less pollution, but some pollution, but it comes to a socially efficient outcome because these two people can now work together on what level of pollution they're okay with and what cost are prices they want associated with that. So when you establish property rights, you're overcoming some of these inefficiencies that we see where in private individuals and private companies may not necessarily think about societal cost and benefits or these external cost and benefits. So 3 approaches to overcoming these inefficiencies are: 1, establish property rights. So if we say who owns the river, then they can start to trade. Then they can say, oh, well, you can pollute the river, but you know, I'm losing $500 on my rent, so you got to pay me $500 a month to pollute my river. It's that idea that once we've established property rights, they can work together and figure out their solution. Another one is mandate clean technology. We can tell the companies like, hey, you're not allowed to pollute in the river, right? That's one way to try to overcome the inefficiency, because we're trying to make it so that they have to pay for this technology to have cleaner technology. And the way they do that is by maybe saying, we'll give you a fine. So if they know that they're either going to have a really expensive fine or they can just pay for the cleaner technology that costs about the same, why wouldn't they just pay for the cleaner technology instead of giving this big fine? Another thing that we can do, and this is something that governments do all the time, is that we can put in a tax or a price for pollution. So we could say, sure, you can pollute the river, but every time you pollute the river, you got to pay us $100 into this general fund that deals with river cleanup and helping all the families on the river. These are different ways to try to internalize the cost for these private individuals so that they make decisions closer to what society's costs and benefits would be. So just so you know what property rights are the legal established titles to ownership, use, and the disposal of the factors of production. So an area to be able to throw your pollution, having rights to that, that's a property right. Establishing property rights can confront producers with the cost of their actions and can make them think about what their actions are truly costing society. Because once there's property rights, then you can start to trade or negotiate based upon those. So there's also the idea of abatement technology. That's the using cleaner technology, right? So producers with property rights, they can do one of 2 things. If I own the river and I can pollute in it all I want, well, I can do one of 2 things. I can produce less and I can pollute less, or I can use cleaner technology because I don't necessarily want to pollute the river, or maybe the town's paying me not to pollute the river. Abatement technology is just different types of production technology that reduces or prevents pollution. For example, smokestacks, you know how like all the soot would come out of smokestacks? You might notice in today's society that we don't necessarily get as dirty and black of soot from those smokestacks as you see in like old commercials or in old cartoons. Part of that is because we actually have scrubbers now. It's an abatement technology. What it is it kind of shoots water through really quickly in the smokestack, and it captures a lot of those nasty chemicals that are in the I can't think of the word today. The soot that comes out, it captures a lot of that, mixes it with the water so that it doesn't get in the airway. Problem is you have to get rid of it some other way, and they tend to bury it, and then it, you know, poisons local watersheds. But besides that, that's an entirely different set of pollution that we'll deal with. But for this first set of pollution, that makes the soot a little cleaner, right? It makes the stuff coming out of the smokestacks just a little bit cleaner. That's an abatement technology. So the producers can consider alternative technologies, and they might choose the least cost or the least costly alternative. So do I put a scrubber on my smokestack, or do I get rid of the smokestack altogether, or do I stop firing coal? I could look at all these different situations and choose which one's the most cost effective for me as the firm. Then there's also the idea of just produce less and pollute less, right? So an alternative to abatement could just be to not produce as much. If your steel company is throwing a bunch of stuff into the river and it's hurting the fishies and it's hurting the people, then the people could pay you to produce less. And then you just produce less and you pollute less because you're producing less, right? By cutting pollution, firms get higher incomes from maybe renting homes on the river. So maybe they decide, okay, well, if I own the river, then I can put some homes along the river. So now instead of making my money on steel by polluting this river, maybe I'll produce a little bit less steel. And now since I own the river, I can put some houses on there and I can charge a higher price for them. And I'll make my money that way. right? So there's lots of different ways that firms and individuals can address the ideas of pollution and try to get to an efficient market equilibrium. Remember that efficient market equilibrium is not where the marginal cost equals the marginal social benefit, right? Because that's where my private decisions are. Instead, what we want is where the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. Now, if we can get this marginal cost, right, if we can shift that marginal cost line upwards and make it closer or equal to the marginal social cost by doing something that makes them internalize their externality or want to make payments similar to what their pollution or their harm or external cost are, well, then that's a way of trying to put the system together and reach an efficient market equilibrium. Okay, so with negative externalities, let's say in this one that we know what our efficient market equilibrium is. We would really like to produce 2 million for $1.25 per can of paint. We know that that's where the efficient market equilibrium is, but that's not necessarily where people would act on their own. Well, maybe we could mandate clean technology and we say, hey, you have to use clean technology. Well, that means that the cost of pollution abatement is going to be similar and will bring us more in line with what this marginal social cost curve is. Another thing that we could do is we could say, hey, we're going to tax you. So you can keep doing this, but we're going to give you a tax. So it's technically a little bit more expensive for you. Well, if we make it more expensive for the producer, that's also going to shift the supply curve backwards, right? And we can try to get it closer to what this marginal social cost curve is. We have a lot of tools in our toolkit, not only as individuals, but as a society with a government in it. We have ways to try to deal with externalities where individual preferences and demand and supply do not necessarily equal what society would prefer when we consider the preferences and harms and costs and benefits of everyone within a system. Okay, I love talking about the Coase theorem. So you know what? Get up, stretch your legs, drink some water. Water's really important, and we're going to start right back here in the next video.